Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back to The Collision. Daniel here, and the new animated comic book film Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse just hit theaters. I've seen it, so let's talk about it. So kind of as like the Disney branch of Marvel, at least in my own opinion, continues to kind of flounder at telling a compelling multiverse story that does sort of harness all the crazy possibilities of the concept, while also not like undercutting the emotional stakes. The Sony version of Marvel seems to have cracked the code. Apparently, animation was the key all along, especially when your animation is mind-blowing and revolutionary. So Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse is a follow-up, a sequel to 2018's sort of real critically acclaimed Into the Spider-Verse. And like a lot of sequels, it kind of builds on what worked on the first one while also kind of ramping up it a notch and going bigger, going better. And I think in some ways, this film does buckle a bit under this ambitious scope. This thing is mammoth. We'll get into some of that. There's a lot going on, so it definitely stretches sort of the limits of its capabilities. But at least for me, I think in the end, it does manage to. It kind of buckles but doesn't break. It does deliver a satisfying, kind of emotionally satisfying movie that even tops sort of the visuals of the first one. So they say imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, and probably the biggest compliment for the visuals in this sort of Spider-Verse series is watching the trailers before the movie and seeing how many upcoming films are clearly trying to mimic and copy what they accomplished in Into the Spider-Verse and kind of built on in the sequel. And kind of like the first film, this thing is an absolute visual splendor. This thing is incredible. The visuals in this, literally every single frame in this entire movie is just bursting with sort of originality, clever ideas. There's so much going on, so many blending of kind of aesthetic styles, and really the visuals in this become as much a character in the experience as the many versions of Spider-Man, and I think is worth the price of admission just to sort of see the crazy, innovative places that the animators take you. I will say that at times there's so much going on visually that it almost does distract from the story itself, where you're sort of focused on all these little details and sort of the way that the colors are moving, the way that the scene is set, that you do sort of forget that there's a story going on in the middle of that. But it is hard to complain about some of the excess of it when so much of what's on screen feels so fresh and original. So the story itself kind of continues the tale of Miles Morales, although Gwen Stacy, who's in the first one, also receives sort of ample kind of increased focus in this time as well, including the entire opening kind of pre-title sequence is purely dedicated just to her backstory and her character. And although I think some of the action does, it's so frantic, although it is thrilling, that it can be moving so fast. And kind of on the other side of that, I think some of the kind of more emotional character moments can drag a little bit. Again, we'll get into this. Is a long movie. There's a lot going on. So despite sort of some of those extremes, I think for the most part, the filmmakers do strike a good balance. And it's refreshing. It seems like in a time where a lot of comic book movies these days kind of sacrifice their heart on the altar of spectacle, and they just sort of dive into the CGI and the visuals, that they forget to tell a meaningful story with characters that feel real and not just sort of necessities so that they can show off their crazy multiverse visuals. Across the Spider-Verse kind of refreshingly does not do that. This story remains focused on the characters despite the visuals and some of the stuff going on, and it does allow these characters to have time to breathe, to be like actual well-rounded people outside of just sort of the plot and some of the action scenes. It is a story that has a wholesome message about family and these characters and the journey they're on, and it does take the time to sort of unpack that and let that kind of come to fruition. So as I've already kind of alluded to several times, this movie is a lot. It is a lot of story. There's a lot going on. It has a mammoth I think overlong runtime. This thing is approaching 2.5 hours, which is just a lot of a movie, especially for one that I think a lot of younger viewers are going to be drawn to just because of some of the style, and even the scenes themselves, despite just the length of this thing, is just a lot. There's a lot of hyper kind of bit. The action is moving so fast, so much dialogue and Easter eggs and references that it can be hard to kind of keep up with everything that's going on, and it does get a little exhausting. Just 2.5 hours of sort of that hyper-paced visuals and action. And kind of a public service announcement, this movie ends on a total cliffhanger to be continued. This is sort of part one. There'll be, I think, Beyond the Spider-Verse coming out next year. So even despite the fact that it's such a long movie with so much going on, it still somehow feels incomplete and somewhat unsatisfying. In our theater, there were a lot of groans when that ending thing came on. So I do think it does sort of test the patience of some audience members, and I think it might be a little bit too much of a good thing. For example, I went to this movie with my two 8-year-old twin boys, and kind of their response after was quite tepid, very lukewarm. I think overall they both enjoyed it, but they both expressed kind of in their own ways that there was just so much going on all the time that they didn't really understand what was happening. And it is a complex, kind of convoluted plot. And I don't necessarily mean that that's a criticism of the film itself, although maybe it's just sort of a heads up as far as expectation for who the kind of intended audience is. I think we've all kind of been conditioned to think of, animation means for children, but this film very much is not. This is a grown-up comic book film that just happens to be told in animated form, which, hey, after all, is sort of the natural medium for the genre. Although I don't think there's necessarily anything overly concerning to like deter parents from bringing their kids, other than some profanity, which we'll get into in just a second. But maybe keep in mind that kind of despite the animated style, this movie clearly isn't kind of catered or made particularly accessible to younger audiences. So as far as content kind of things going on the surface of this thing, language, like I said, there is some profanity in this, which was, again, it was disappointing to me. I think it was unnecessary. In some ways, it felt like the movie's way of establishing that this isn't just for kids. This is sort of a mature story. It's not like over the top. You're not bombarded with profanity, but there is sort of a handful, like a character, very clearly, what the heck, but they don't say heck, or several other kind of minor, referring to the buttocks, but not that way. This way that felt kind of unnecessary. And then there's sort of some profanity adjacent terms like heck, or there's a scene, kind of an extended scene where the characters say shoot, like over and over and over and over. There's a villain named Typeface, which tells Spider-Man to go to Helvetica, which, hey, it is kind of amusing, but it's obviously playing off of profanity. And then there are two different kind of isolated instances where characters are speaking about like a person's holes in an innocent way, but it's taken by other characters to be kind of wrongly as something crude. So there is sort of some language throughout this film. As far as violence, really not anything beyond just what you'd expect from a kind of a comic book, kind of that standard action fare. Characters get smashed and punched and kicked. Like you would expect. Several characters do die or are shown to have died, although most of their deaths is depicted off-scene, and it's more like flashbacks or allusions to the death. You don't see a whole lot of death. You do see a couple on screen, and there is sort of one scene where one of the universes in the multiverse is like evaporating, being destroyed, and characters are sort of evaporating, and there is sort of a father kind of holding his kid, and the kid sort of evaporates, and so there is sort of some of that, but nothing overly concerning as far as violence goes. For sexuality, not anything to be concerned about. Nothing much beyond this sort of harmless romantic dynamic between some of the characters. It is mentioned that by one male character that a female character left her jacket and her toothbrush at his house, which makes another male character sort of jealous. Although sort of like any of the sexual implication for that is left sort of vague and open-ended, and sort of implies that nothing actually happened from that sexually, despite what some of the characters are taking. So nothing there. I know before this movie came out, due to like a screenshot in the trailer, there's a lot of fuss that in sort of Gwen Stacy's room, there's like a sign or a poster pinned to her wall that said "Protect Trans Kids," and people had opinions on that, and that the film was going to be pushing ideologies. I'm assuming that was still in the film. I didn't see it, despite the fact that I was looking for it. So I think either way, I don't think it's something that any kid is going to pick up on or notice or in any kind of meaningful way. As far as themes, kind of worldview stuff going on beneath the surface of this film actually kind of tackles some pretty weighty, interesting, kind of philosophical worldview questions. Kind of one of the main things that comes out all throughout this, which I think is consistent with a lot of sort of these multiverse type stories, is this sort of the question of like, do our choices actually make a difference in the long run, or are we just following some predetermined script, and we're just sort of a slave to like our circumstances and sort of the things are around us. And it kind of explores that theme in several different ways, which I think have some the spiritual significance. Kind of in the film, kind of despite all the differences between like the endless amount of variants of Spider-Man, it's revealed that there's certain kind of, they call it canon events, things that have to happen to each of these characters in order to kind of keep things working across all the universes, like the death of Uncle Ben, some of those sort of things that have to happen, which kind of puts Miles Morales in this tension between kind of wanting to write his own story, wanting to make good choices, wanting to save people, while also sort of fighting against the expectations that, hey, so much of what happens in his life is already determined, and there's consequences for trying to break out of that. And can we kind of transcend some of our circumstances, or is it sort of our path set for us? In the film, maybe in like a more less philosophical way, the film also kind of unpacks that from the perspective of families. Family plays a central role in this film. There's several different families, and a lot of the main like dynamics and tension and like development in this film comes from that relationship with families. But kind of each of these sets of parents and kind of guardians wrestle with that same question as far as, how much control do they have over like the future of their kids, and how much they sort of need to let go and sort of trust fate, trust that things will happen, or can they kind of guide it and steer sort of the direction of their kids' lives. And I'll say the film doesn't necessarily give answers to these questions, at least not yet. This is part one of a two-part thing, so maybe they'll kind of delve deeper into it. But it is an interesting theme to kind of explore. Obviously, it kind of evokes some of like sort of the classic theological like predestination and free will. How much do we have do our choices matter? But maybe even on like a broader level, just sort of theism, or kind of against like determinism. Like, are we just sort of cells and we have no control, or is there something that kind of goes beyond our circumstance, like a higher purpose that we can like participate in? So although the film itself doesn't necessarily bring religion into it, I think the way that it is exploring it, at least so far, does seem to kind of fall in line with sort of that more spiritual sense of, hey, there is purpose. We are more than just sort of our circumstances in like the natural world. Maybe one other thing we don't want to get don't need to go into it, unpack it too much, but just families. Families is a central theme all throughout this. And it's just a very wholesome depiction of what a family looks like, what a supportive family looks like. There is disagreements. Parents disagree with children. Children kind of rebel against their wishes of their parents. Parents make mistakes. Kids make mistakes. But kind of all throughout this film, the way that they unpack and allow those dynamics to kind of breathe is this a very positive, like you never question the fact that these families love each other. And there is moments where on both sides, the parent to the kid and the kid to the parent, where they kind of reevaluate their choices and they apologize and kind of learn to adapt as their relationship is shifting. So again, I think it's not just a Christian theme, but it is a very positive, kind of wholesome message on just the importance of like a healthy, supportive family. So in the end, I enjoyed Across the Spider-Verse. I wasn't maybe blown away as much as or enthusiastic after as I hoped to be, or as I suspect a lot of other viewers will be. But it is hard to not appreciate a film like this that does feel original. It does feel like it has something fresh to offer in contrast to a lot of the other kind of more corporate feeling films that seem to be releasing in theaters these days. And just we're at a time where like Hollywood feels quite stale. This is something new, and I do appreciate that. Is it too long and kind of overly convoluted? Probably. Was the profanity unnecessary? I think so. That's something I wasn't, as a parent with my kids, wasn't pleased necessarily about that. But I do think overall, as like a complete package with like the spectacular visuals and just the more emotionally meaningful story, I do think it was well worth the trip back into the Spider-Verse. But hey, let me know what you guys think. If you guys see this movie, if you guys take your kids, you love comic books, you want to go see it, you just love visual styles and aesthetics, and you want to kind of see all the stuff they do with it, would love to have a conversation in the comment section, hear your thoughts, talk about it. And if you haven't done so, I encourage you guys, subscribe to the channel, become a Collider, join us some of the fun stuff we're doing here. But most of all, guys, stay safe. Thanks for watching, and continue to collide with your world for Christ.